My brother made my birthday party get canceled because he asked my dad to go fishing that weekend, just the two of them. But when they came back, they were crying a lot about what they had experienced. 2 weeks ago, I was about to have my birthday. Unfortunately, my awful younger brother decided he wanted to go away for the weekend without me, and the party ended up being canceled. My 15-year-old brother is my dad's favorite, and whatever he says in this house is what gets done. At least there was some balance when my mom was alive, but she passed away from lung cancer a couple of years ago. Since then, life has been terrible for me, because my dad only seems to care about my brother and thinks that since I'm older, I can handle everything on my own. Even on my birthday, I had planned to go out with my friends at night, and of course, my dad was going to pay for all our plans. But just the day before my birthday, my brother threw a tantrum and told my dad he wanted to go away for the weekend because he had been rejected from the soccer team and needed something to distract him. If you ask me, it wasn't surprising that he didn't get selected for the team because not only is he incredibly spoiled and annoying, but he's also not a good player and has no team spirit, which is obvious. So, it shouldn't have been a shock that he wasn't chosen, but he still had a huge meltdown over it, and my dad had to give in. I was in shock because all of this was happening right in front of me, and I decided to stand up for myself. I told my dad that I wasn't going to stay at home while they went away for the weekend, especially not on my birthday of all days, because that's usually what happens whenever my brother decides he needs a break from everything. He and my dad go on trips together, and I stay at home. They both love fishing, so they go on fishing trips, and my dad has a friend with a cabin in the woods, so it's pretty easy for them to just go. I'm not really a fan of adventures, and I definitely don't like the woods, so I'm not like my brother and dad at all. The first few times this happened, I offered to stay at home, but after that, whenever they needed to go, they didn't even ask me if I had any plans, and I stayed dealing with their absence. This has been happening since my mom passed away. They never used to do this when she was alive. I don't have an exact problem with staying home alone, but the issue is that I'm not allowed to have anyone over, because my dad thinks that if I have a party or do things like that, I'll end up destroying the house. He's really strict about that kind of thing. I once made the mistake of inviting a couple of friends over, and we had been really careful to keep the house clean, but my dad decided to check the security cameras and found out. The next day, I got the lecture of my life, and he told me that he didn't want me inviting friends over when the house was empty because he didn't trust us since we were young teenagers, and that never leads to good things. So I couldn't invite friends over, nor could I go out on my own because my dad thinks that's dangerous, and I stayed home when they weren't there. Obviously, I didn't want that to happen on my birthday because it would mean I couldn't have my friends over or go out with them. It was my 18th birthday, for God's sake. It was an important day for me, and I wanted it to go my way, at least once. But my brother couldn't even let me have that, and my dad even offered to take me with them and hire someone to take care of the house for the weekend. But my brother insisted on going without me. Since I had never been to the cabin and didn't even know anything about it, he said it would be another task to introduce me to everything. He was sure I wouldn't even enjoy it. Besides, if I was there, he wouldn't be able to distract himself from what was going on at school because everyone would be congratulating me on my birthday, including some guys from the soccer team because I'm friends with them. So my dad even took back the offer to take me, and I stayed home. This kind of thing has been happening since my mom passed away. It's always been pretty obvious to me that my dad has a favorite, and it's not me. I never had a problem with that, but that day, I just lost my patience. I started shouting at my dad, and we had a huge fight because of how he had been acting and treating me since my mom passed away. He never praised me, even when I accomplished something big, like winning competitions or doing well in class. But my brother got praised for even the smallest things. He also acted very differently with us. He was pretty distant with me, but with my brother, he was a completely different person. He actually acted like a father with him. I had always tolerated it because I knew my brother was very much like him, so it was easier for him to connect with my brother, but that wasn't a reason for him to treat me like that. So I stood my ground and said that if he left me at home alone on my birthday and didn't let me invite my friends or even go out with them, then I would do whatever I wanted and they couldn't stop me. But my dad threatened me and said that if I did any of those things, he would cut off my university funds and I would be left with nothing. I'm supposed to start university in a couple of months, so I couldn't take the risk because I don't have my own money. Unfortunately, I had to let them go on the morning of my birthday, and I had to cancel all my plans. My dad told me that if I wanted, I could go out with my friends as soon as they got back, and he would give me money for an even bigger party. But that didn't comfort me because I wanted to go out with my friends on my birthday, not spend the day at home alone. So I was really upset all day and didn't do much until I fell asleep that night. The next morning, however, I woke up to a surprise. Someone started ringing the doorbell very early. When I went to see who it was, I realized it was my grandfather. My dad's parents passed away when I was little because they were pretty old, and my dad is the youngest of 4 siblings. They weren't exactly very close to the rest of the family, so after his parents passed away, we only spoke and saw his family during holidays. But I used to be very close to my mom's parents, and we saw them pretty often when she was alive because they came as often as they could. They live in another state, so they had to fly here to see us, but they always told us it was worth it. After my mom passed away, however, things changed, and things got even worse for my grandfather because 8 months after losing my mom, he also lost his wife. They had a car accident, and my grandmother fought for her life for a couple of days before succumbing to her injuries. My grandfather is paralyzed from the waist down and has to use a wheelchair to move around. So, in the last 2 years, I've only been able to see him once a year during holidays. It's been pretty tough because he used to be full of life, but after losing his wife and daughter, he became very quiet and sad. Obviously, everyone feels sorry for him, but he says that it makes him feel worse because he doesn't want people to feel sorry for him. So, I try to act like myself around him, even though seeing him makes me want to cry because I just miss the person he used to be. That's part of the reason why I've never told my grandfather about my strange relationship with my dad and brother. I didn't want to make things harder for him. Sharing that with him would only make him feel bad since he couldn't do anything about it, and I didn't want to make him feel even more powerless. So, every time I visited him in the last 2 years, I focused on the happy things. But the day after my birthday, when he showed up at my door with his nurse to surprise me, I ended up breaking down because I got so emotional. A lot of family members had wished me the best, but him coming all the way here just to surprise me really touched me. Knowing that even my brother and dad wouldn't have done something like this for me made me start crying as soon as I saw him. I got so emotional, and he had to comfort me for a while before I could thank him. I tried to hide why I started crying as soon as I saw him, telling him that I was moved that he had taken the trouble to fly all the way here despite his limitations with the wheelchair and everything. But I guess he realized that something had gone terribly wrong, and after a while he started asking where my dad and brother were. Initially, I tried to make up excuses for them, but honestly, I was exhausted from trying to hide the fact that they were just terrible to me. So, I told him the truth, and he seemed really shocked. After processing it, he started looking more angry than surprised. He told me that if I wanted, I could live with him for the next few months until I started university. To be honest, that would actually be easier for me because I decided to go to university in another state since I needed some space away from my dad and brother. Coincidentally, my university is closer to my grandfather's house than to here. So, if I stayed with my grandfather, I'd only have to drive a couple of hours to get home, while here, I'd have to take a flight back and forth. It's not like they'd miss me here. My dad has my brother, and my brother has my dad. So I didn't even have to think twice before accepting my grandfather's offer. He told me that he would leave as soon as my dad and brother came home because he had some issues to settle with my dad. He stayed with me that day, and I told him everything that had been going on in the last few years since my mom passed away. It was like the floodgates finally opened, and I had someone to share everything with. Of course, my friends knew about it, but it wasn't like they could really help, and they all had their own problems. I wasn't close enough to the rest of my family to talk to them about it, so it wouldn't have made a difference anyway. When my grandfather asked me why I'd never told him anything, I explained that I didn't want him to feel bad. He told me that he would have fought for custody, but honestly, it would have been very unlikely for him to win custody because my dad wasn't actively abusing me or neglecting me. He said he would have found a way to help me and that I should have told him sooner. Anyway, I hadn't told him before, and that's how things were. I had to endure the situation for a long time, But this was the last straw, and fortunately, my grandfather was here to finally get me out of it. The next day, when my dad and brother finally came home in the morning, they got a big surprise. My grandfather usually treats both my brother and me equally since he's not my dad, but this time he didn't even bother to greet my brother. He didn't even wait before confronting my dad about what had happened and what he had heard from me. For the first time in his life, my dad actually seemed ashamed of himself and nervous. I knew for sure he had always wanted to impress my grandfather. Even when we visited after my mom passed away, he made a big deal out of treating my brother and me well, but I had no idea he was so afraid of my grandfather. I liked that for the first time, he had to answer to someone for the way he had treated me. After scolding my dad for a few minutes, my grandfather told my brother and me to go take a walk because he needed to discuss some things with my dad privately. He didn't want either of us to come back home until he called us. It was confusing, but it was clear we weren't supposed to discuss anything at that moment. So my brother and I left the house. We're not exactly friends, so we went our separate ways for about 45 minutes. He was at one of his friends' houses, and I was at one of mine. When my grandfather finally called us back, he seemed in a very bad mood and really angry. When I walked in, it was obvious my dad had been crying because his eyes were swollen. That was shocking because my dad rarely cries, and I knew something had definitely happened. Anyway, my grandfather told me to pack my things, just the important ones, and that the rest would be picked up later. So I did what he asked, and about half an hour later, I had a bag ready. Then we took a taxi to the nearest hotel. There, my grandfather told me that from now on, I would live with him. It was convenient because, as he had said, it meant I'd be closer to my university too, so I had no problem with that. But when I asked what had happened with my dad, he told me it was none of my concern at the moment and that he just wanted me to focus on my future. As I was leaving, I noticed that my dad hadn't said anything to me. He hadn't even said goodbye. My brother didn't even seem to care. So that was it. 2 days after I moved out of my house with my things, my grandfather and I took a flight to his place, and I've been living here ever since. I didn't think I'd hear from my dad or my brother soon, and I had stopped wondering what had happened between my grandfather and my dad because clearly my dad was happy enough to let me go. But that changed 2 days ago when I received a message from my dad apologizing for everything and saying he hadn't realized that I had felt neglected. He acknowledged that he had failed as a father and hadn't even realized it because he was so busy with my brother, the only child he had managed to connect with. He said he had always considered me very different from him, and that's why he had always kept his distance because he didn't think he could understand me. But with my brother, it was different. He added that not building a good relationship with me was the biggest mistake of his life. He realized that thanks to my grandfather. I already knew all that, so it didn't surprise me. And honestly, I wasn't even upset that he was closer to my brother than to me, since I had always been closer to my mom than to him. What bothered me was the fact that he had mistreated me and hadn't even realized it. But I guess he realized it after I moved out. He said he really wanted to apologize and make things right. He told me he knew I had moved in with my grandfather now, and that he thought I'd stay with him until I finished university, but he'd really like me to come back home so we could talk and fix this. He said that's what my mom would have wanted, and I think I agree. It's probably what my mom would have wanted because when she was here, she was always pushing my dad and me to spend more time together, but we never listened to her. However, I don't want to commit to anything right now, so I haven't responded to my dad's message. If I'm honest, I'm not even sure if I want to fix my relationship with them at the moment or not. I haven't started university yet, but it's only a couple of weeks away. Even when I do start, I plan to return to my grandfather's house on alternate weekends, so that would be more convenient than going back to my dad's. Besides, it's not just about convenience. It's also about the relationship I have with my grandfather. I don't have that with my dad or my brother, so I don't feel obligated to go back to them to try to fix things. But on the other hand, if he's trying, shouldn't I too? I've been having a lot of mixed feelings about what my dad said, and I don't know what to do with this situation. Would I be the bad guy if I told my dad that I don't want to move back in with him and that I want to stay with my grandfather? Honestly, I don't know why my dad would want me to stay at home. Whenever he and my brother would go on fishing trips, he used to tell me that it was dangerous to leave the house completely empty. Even when we went on family trips when my mom was alive, he'd hire someone to take care of the house. As for whether or not I'm my dad's biological son, I don't know how to answer that. I've heard of people who mistreat their adopted children compared to their biological children, so I wouldn't be surprised if I'm not actually his son, but no one has said anything that suggests I'm not, and I don't have any proof of paternity to show otherwise. So, as far as I'm concerned, I'm definitely his son. If you ask me, I don't even think it matters whether I'm his biological son or not, because he's the one who raised me along with my mom. Biological or not, I'm his son in some way, and he should have respected that and treated me the same as my brother. Anyway, that's not the point now. Update 1. After much deliberation, I decided to ask my grandfather if I was really my dad's biological son. I couldn't stop thinking about it after several people in the comments suggested that maybe he was treating me differently because I wasn't really his child. There was also a comment about my grandfather mentioning trying to get custody of me if I had told him how my dad was treating me before. I started to think that he wouldn't have said that if he didn't have reasons to believe he could have gotten custody. So, I felt I had to ask him. I had to gather a lot of courage, but in the end, I felt I deserved to know the truth. Last night, I sat down with him and simply asked the question without thinking too much about it. He was surprised, but then he told me he knew this moment would come at some point. Even though my mom always tried to keep it a secret, I'm old enough to know now. It turns out I am definitely my dad's biological son, and we know for sure because several paternity tests were done to confirm it. Apparently, it's not my paternity that's the issue, but rather an incident that happened before I was born, which likely caused my dad to resent me. My parents had been married for 2 years at the time and had been together for 4 years. She always regretted it, but my mom ended up having an affair with one of her friends, and my dad found out about it. She ended the affair, and they agreed to go to couples counseling, but a couple of weeks later, she found out she was pregnant. The only problem was that she had no idea who the father of the baby was. My dad wanted her to terminate the pregnancy completely, but my mom didn't agree. So they had to wait for the pregnancy to reach a stage where they could do a paternity test. Until then, my mom's lover was part of the process because he could have been the father if he was. My mom said she didn't want to be unfair to her future child and said the 3 of them would have to raise the child together. My dad obviously didn't agree with that idea and insisted that only he and my mom should have custody of the baby, regardless of who the real biological father was. But my mom wanted to be fair, so they ended up arguing a lot about this. They decided to stay together because they really loved each other, and that ended up being pretty bad for me because, even though I was my dad's child, after they found out, my mom cut all ties with her lover. That didn't seem to be enough for my dad. After I was born, a couple more tests were done to make sure I was absolutely and 100% my dad's biological son, and I was. It had been confirmed, but despite that, my dad continued to fight with my mom until she threatened to leave with me. Now, I'm obviously not saying my mom was right. She definitely shouldn't have cheated on my dad, and she should have tried to talk to him before seeking love outside of the marriage. But if my dad had given her a second chance, he should have tried to make it work instead of constantly fighting with her. I think he's a really confused man because, even though he decided to stay with my mom and make it work despite her infidelity, he couldn't handle it and decided to take all his anger and frustration out on me. The fact that I wasn't anything like him in terms of personality probably irritated him even more, and that's how we ended up in this situation where I was resented for something that wasn't my fault. When my mom was alive, it seemed like they got along well enough, so I never would have guessed they had problems like this in the past. But I guess it makes sense when you consider that he had me to resent, and he didn't need to take his anger out on my mom. Anyway, that's part of the story. The reason my dad seems to feel so guilty for treating me badly in the past is because my grandfather told him he was going to be excluded from the inheritance. My dad's inheritance had to be divided into 4 parts because of his siblings, so he didn't get much at that time. But after my mom passed away, my grandfather apparently changed his will to leave everything to my dad and his grandchildren. However, after my grandfather found out how my dad was treating me, He had a discussion with him and really scolded him. He told my dad that he felt sorry that his daughter had cheated on him, but that wasn't a reason to still hold it against me since none of it was my fault. I wasn't even born when it happened, and even though I wasn't anything like my dad, I was still his biological son, and that had been confirmed by several paternity tests, some of which he even did independently without my mom's knowledge to prevent her from interfering with the results in any way. So, he really had no reason to treat me the way he did, and yet one day he decided that he wasn't going to treat me like his son, and instead, he was going to punish me for what my mom did. That wasn't acceptable, and my grandfather told him that after finding out how I was being treated, he could expect nothing from him anymore. Now, any part of the inheritance that my dad was going to receive would go to me instead. My dad had been crying about this, and also because he felt like he was going to lose everything at once. So when I asked my grandfather if my dad was reaching out to me because of the inheritance, or if he was really sorry, my grandfather told me he genuinely had no idea. For what it's worth, my grandfather told me that my dad seemed really upset, but I still don't know if he has hidden motives or not. It's hard to trust him after everything that's happened, so I guess I'll continue not responding to my dad until I'm sure. Update 2. Well, I'm in college now. I started a couple of weeks ago, and it's been going really well so far, though it's only been 2 weeks, so it's hard to say. I forgot to update you on what happened with my dad because, to be honest, after the message he sent me, nothing really happened. I didn't respond, and he didn't bother trying to contact me again, so I guess he was only looking for me because of the inheritance. If he had genuinely felt bad about everything, he would have definitely made another attempt to reach out to me. Now it's been almost 4 months since we last spoke, so I don't think he'll try to contact me anytime soon. As for my brother, we were never really close when we lived together, and now we have no contact at all, and I'm perfectly fine with that. The only person in my family I still keep in touch with is my grandfather, and we talk every 2 days on the phone. I was a little mad at him for hiding these things from me, but on the other hand, he was just trying to do what was right for his family. I don't think I could have handled the truth back then. So he did the right thing by not telling me sooner. At least now I'm an adult, and I can process this. If I had found out about my mom's infidelity earlier, I don't know how I would have reacted. Knowing about her past has definitely changed my perspective on her, but not in a way that makes me hate her. I just realized she was an imperfect person, not the perfect mother I once idealized. But that's okay. I'll always love her because, no matter what she did, she's still my mom. Anyway, that's it, I think. Update 3. I wanted to share a significant update. I'm about to graduate in a couple of weeks, which is exciting but also a bit overwhelming at the same time. However, this joy has been somewhat overshadowed because my grandfather won't be able to attend my graduation. About a year ago, he had been dealing with some health issues for a long time, partly due to an accident he had years ago. Despite everything, he was always a strong and optimistic person, but his body just couldn't take it anymore. It's hard to accept his passing since he was my biggest support all this time. As for my family, I still don't have any contact with them. However, I recently received an email from my dad congratulating me on my upcoming graduation. I guess he found out somehow. In the email, he shared some details about my brother, saying that he still lives with him despite being 19 years old. Apparently, he didn't get into any university he applied to, and instead of going to a community college, he decided to look for a job and see what the future holds. I thought about whether I should reply, but in the end, I decided not to. Right now, I'm content with how things are, and I don't want to reopen old wounds. Plus, he didn't even attend my grandfather's funeral, probably because of the resentment he had for being excluded from the inheritance. The only reason he's writing to me is to ask me to share my inheritance or something like that. Now that I'm writing this, I think the best thing will be to block his email, just like I did with his phone numbers years ago. Also, I'll soon finish college and move to another state since I've landed a good job, but it's in a different city. There's no risk of him showing up at my house one day or anything like that, because I won't tell anyone who could tell him where I live. As for my grandfather's house, it's been rented out this whole time, and it will stay that way. I don't have any use for it now, but I have memories of it, so I'm not sure I could sell it. It's not like I'm making much from it because the person who manages it, meaning they handle repairs, showings, and all that stuff, takes a good portion of the rent. It's not that the rent is very high, but I don't have another option since I don't live in the city to take care of all that myself. This will probably be my last update since I don't have anything else to share, at least related to my dad and brother.